I think it's great that we disagree so clearly. So I think we have a great conversation here. So Paul has suggested that the only reason for identifying different types of knowledge is for Christians or for religious believers to excuse themselves from seriously examining, scientifically examining the reality of their theology or of their theistic beliefs. But I mean, I completely reject that viewpoint. I mean, to argue that history is science is these days fairly unusual, even for historians. Historians in the beginning of the 20th century, quite a few of them did lay claim to laws of history, which in a certain case they would refer to as certain as the laws of gravity. But I don't think that's actually a very widespread opinion within history. And I mean, to give an analogy, it's as if, you know, one would say that the only sense that I trust is my eyes, and I'll set aside, you know, my hearing, my touch, my taste, my smell. We, as creatures within a world, are trying to find out what is real, what is true, and we're doing so in lots and lots of different ways, all the time. You know, if you think about language, language is not a subject that subjects itself to scientific discussion. That it isn't developed on scientific principles, and yet science needs language in order to operate. So science actually requires lots of other types of knowledge in order to function. And you know, history is one example that I offer, and I'm glad you sort of took that as my paradigm and offered the countervailing view on that. But it's not the only one. I mean, you could also think in terms of, well, what about literature, or what about philosophy, or what about ethics, or what about the law or justice, or all of those kinds of things. Those kinds of things are very often focused on intangibles. Science is hamstrung when it comes to intangibles. Natural science certainly cannot deal with intangibles because you can't do experiments or observations of the type that science requires. So we clearly disagree on this.
So there was a lot in there. So first of all, I want to say that I didn't mean to imply that the only response was going to be to try to exclude religion from scientific scrutiny. I merely said that one could do that. Now, to the history point, I think the one crux of how we look at this differently gets down to how you conceive science. And as we talked before, I'm not saying this is just a semantic issue, although how you conceive science is crucial here. So the way I'm conceiving science is more broad than you are. I think that's clear, because you can identify other principles like falsifiability and Occam's razor, and there's even, you know, not mistaking correlation for causation and checking confirmation bias and a whole host of things that science uses.
Yeah.
And
that theology uses.
And that's fine. And that any responsible search for knowledge should use. And that I can't identify anything beyond those things that science uses that is appropriate for a responsible search for knowledge, like thinking that a feeling is knowledge, or considering that, you know, like a revelation from God is going to lead you to, or what seems to you to be a revelation from God will lead you to actually knowledge because of the principle of falsifiability and Occam's razor and all those things.
You've raised a very important point. Let me just very, if I may, quickly,
Sure.
just point out, we don't want to get stuck in a semantic argument. So once upon a time, science did mean any organized body of knowledge. And it didn't just mean natural science. Natural science in those days was referred to as natural philosophy, okay? So when I use the word science, I generally, unqualified, I generally mean natural science, okay? So I do think there is a clear distinction between natural science and these other sciences, if you want to call them that, okay? I'm not going to argue about whether you want to call them science or not. It's just that they're different from the natural sciences. That's what I want to maintain. So I think, therefore, you're saying, well, look, there are certain principles of, let's say, critical thinking is an expression that is often used, that are common to many disciplines. I want to say that's absolutely correct. But in that sense, theology is just as much a discipline that can exert critical thinking as history or philosophy or any of these other ones, okay?
No, that's true, and I would say that the conclusions of theology are subject to critical examination. There's going to be no guarantee that the conclusions of theology are valid. That would have to play out in how that's worked out. Let me go back to history for a second. So, yeah, I mean, if you define science this way, then we would both agree certain conclusions follow. If you define it this way, other conclusions would follow, and that's purely from the semantic history. But by looking at the commonalities, it seems to me that the commonalities that science gives, quote unquote, to the other disciplines are absolutely essential. Like Richard Carrier was talking about in terms of historians make predictions just like scientists. And if you look at the history of history as an academic discipline, it may well be that that principle has not been identified or most people don't understand it. But Carrier's point is that, in effect, that's what they're doing anyway when they do good history, because that's what you have to do to reach a good conclusion. And if they, stray from that path and maybe come up with just an interpretation that's not very good knowledge. In fact, he uses an example from biblical studies, which is his specialty, in which he says there's currently a whole crop of books looking at Jesus as a mystic or a political revolutionary or a person wanting to help the downtrodden. And each of these historians make their case for Jesus as, there's like more than a dozen figures. And the problem is that there's no way to adjudicate any of those claims because they aren't really based on good principles. So historians can well, make careers out of this sort of thing, but that doesn't mean that what they're producing is actually good knowledge. It could be interpretation, it could be very subjective.
I think you're tougher on the historians than I am. Okay.